Behind all of that is a complex system that actually determines whether climate actions happens or doesn't. From the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to the annual Conference of the Parties negotiations and the landmark Paris Agreement, don't focus on adaptation because these things are going to happen every year because given that we're highly, vulnerable to climate change. You briefly mentioned some of the challenges that Pakistan has been facing, but what do you think are the biggest challenges that Pakistan faces, when it comes to, turning these international pledges into actual implementation on the ground?
I think Pakistan's single biggest problem is Pakistan's dollar shortage. And I think that really deeply goes into the climate problem. I think generally, if you look at how the framework's been built, for example, where with COP being the conversation tool, with the UNFCCC being the agency that's kind of binding everyone together, with then the multilaterals like the World Bank in place, actively looking at items, with specific funds like GCF in place, country to country agreements bilateral is in place as well. I think the framework's there. I think the thought to put it all together was really on point.
Climate change is often talked about in big abstract terms: global summits, billion-dollar pledges, and international agreements. But behind all of that is a complex system that actually determines whether climate actions happens or doesn't. From the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to the annual Conference of the Parties negotiations and the landmark Paris Agreement, countries around the world are making commitments to tackle climate change. But how do these commitments turn into real action? And where does a country like Pakistan, one of the most vulnerable nations, fit into this global system? Today, we're unpacking how climate governance really works: the institutions, the finance, the accountability, and the transparency, and whether this system is actually delivering the results where it matters the most. And to help make sense of it all, we have with us Mekaeel Malik, founder of Climate Finance Pakistan. Hello, Mekaeel. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, to start, can you break down how the global finance system actually works? What roles do frameworks like the UNFCCC, COP meetings, and the Paris Agreement play?
Hi, Mahin. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think, at times we look at climate finance as a very siloed entity outside the world of finance, whilst I think that we really need to look at climate as a completely embedded in the global financial system. So just like global finance, how global markets work, climate finance is very similar. We have two or three different avenues to really specifically look at. The first breakdown will obviously be the public side and the private side. And within the public and private side, like always have the multilaterals, the international organizations, DFIs and whatnot. So to kind of really hone into on this, I would say at the global level, there are large institutions, funds such as the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, and other institutions that are deploying capital. How active that capital deployment is a debate on how effective or efficient they are at this point in time. And of course, then there's sovereign government entities that are deploying climate finance capital. But again, how large is that? What are the promises? What they've delivered is another question. And then it comes down to your local governments in the federations, in the provinces, and then of course you have the most energetic and my favorite part of it, the private capital deployment within the country, right? So there are like 4 or 5 tiers to this, and obviously you've mentioned some of the organizations such as the UNFCCC and the IPCC. I think these are entities that are holistically looking at financing in the on the climate lens, but I'm not sure how effective they are as deployment agencies or actually getting finance together.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive analysis. I would actually now like to, touch upon the nationally determined contributions that, countries have to submit. And Pakistan has also submitted the NDCs, and I think now we recently just submitted NDCs 3.0. So when we're discussing the NDCs, how do these pledges, actually move from paper to real world action, in your opinion?
So the NDCs are, I think, they're a brilliant concept if actually put into, used in spirit fully. So, for example, Pakistan signed the first NDC document in the last PTI government, and the headline of that was that we were going to change our energy mix. So, just to give you a figure, currently 40% of Pakistan's energy is renewable, 60% is fossil fuel, etc. And we promised that by 2030 we would reverse that mix. So 60% would be renewable and 40% would be other. Uh, to give you some maths, you need close to $150 billion to actually make that happen. With the whole transition on the energy lines, the IPPs, solar, wind, all the installations you would need. So to my mind, is that actually practically doable for Pakistan? I don't think so. Not given the current fiscal deficit problems, especially because a lot of these power projects are 90% import dependent. We don't really produce any of these things in this country. So although it's a great idea, and I really wish for us to be able to implement this, I don't think it's a realistic possibility. Which is why the NDCs 3.0 that you've mentioned, we've kind of made an amendment to what we can deliver. But the fact of the matter is that we had promise something, and those NDC contributions are actually very actively tracked, and they're tracked at a country level and then at the subnational level as well. So I think as a concept they're great, but I do fear that in Pakistan at times we don't really do the math of what we can achieve, and we make promises that are a bit out of our reach.
Yeah, so climate action usually, depends on funding, and this is what we've usually heard as well, right? What are the main global financial mechanisms that are, supporting this, like the Green Climate Fund that you just, spoke about earlier as well, or development banks?
Okay, so I think let's just take Pakistan's example here specifically, and let's look at what GCF has done and what the other development banks have done and what Pakistan has done locally. If you look at the GCF, that's literally low single digit percentage funding of climate finance globally. So even though it's everyone's favorite buzzword in the climate world, it's actually something that everyone's globally competing for, and the money out there is sprinkles on the dollar. Then you look at the development banks, and I do think that the development banks are actually doing something that is way more climate aligned. I mean, if you look at the IFC and their pledge for over $1 billion to Pakistan for green finance, green linked bankable projects, such as the ethanol plant that's coming up, or the SAF fuel, the jet fuel that's going to be sustainable. Those are projects that are actually bankable, that are green linked, and have a dollarized return. So I'm a fan of these projects. And then on the tertiary side, you have these development bank agencies, multilaterals funding the government. And the heaviest book on all of these is the Punjab government's. So if you look at the Punjab government's loan book, you'll see $5 to $10 billion on it, which is an insane figure. And then the biggest problem you'll see is, as the Pakistan government has at times, we are unable to execute the checkpoints of the loans we've received. So actually, we might have X billion on the loan book. We've actually not received that money because we've not been able to implement the promises we made to get the next part of the loan tranche. So it's actually a very complicated ecosystem where in climate financing, the competition is global. You're not going to get extra points for being Pakistan or South Asia. And when the competition is global, your project development has to be at a scale that can compete with, the regional partners, the small island states, the Indias of the world, because they're also looking for the same capital. And then when you receive all of this money, are you able to then execute the project to then take the check marks and then go on to the next financing stage? So I think it's a multi-pronged problem at this point in time. So we'll see a lot of inflated numbers on the books of the government's balance sheet especially, but the execution capacity is a very different story.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, that the implementation and the execution strategy has to be improved, when it comes to especially projects that are related to climate change. Otherwise, a massive change won't come by. So Pakistan, as you know, is obviously considered highly vulnerable. How is the country, do you think, engaging with global climate mechanisms to, address risks like floods and heat waves?
I think so. What Pakistan's done well in the last few years is that as a country, we've become very pro technology. And I think our government has become very e enabled. And in all of that, there's been a lot of data mapping that started to happen. And I think that some of the organizations, let's just look at the flood mitigation example at this point in time, right? We had the massive floods of 2022, $30 billion documented as economic losses. Then you had the floods of 2025, which were not as big, but still a large displacement of individuals, houses damaged, crops burnt, all of that. And if you just look at the flood example, I think the NDMA, the national agency, and the PDMAs in the provinces, they were pretty good, very on point with when what was going to happen, right? And then if you look at the district administrations and their sync of their reaction time, I mean, given even in 2025 the scale of the flooding, and I mean even one human life lost is a lot, but given the scale of what happened, we could have had a bigger number that could have come out, and
Yeah.
not just on the human side but also on the economic side. So I do think that with the data mapping and integrations, and also because our governments have now gone through a few phases of flooding, our reaction time is much better. We also appreciate what to do. Big kudos to Rescue 1122 for what they did over the past over those few months, right? So I think that we're improving as a reactive government. We're just not improving as planners, as what to do so this does not happen, or how to mitigate this uh, you know for the next 3 years, the next 5 years. And I think that, to my mind, is the biggest problem. If you look at even the glove projects in GB, and they've done some good work, but then you look at the crazy flash flooding that comes down south of the river. You've not had any embankment work done. You've had 3 floods so far going through there. You've not done anything. The development agencies come whenever there's a flood. They break 2 hotels, and that's a new cycle, and off we go. So I think our biggest problem is that is also our biggest strength. We're good at reacting, but we've only become people who react. That's my concern.
Yeah, I think we need to focus more on adaptation. We truly focus more on mitigation. And until and unless we don't focus on adaptation, because these things are going to happen every year, because given that we're highly vulnerable to climate change. So you briefly mentioned some of the challenges that Pakistan has been facing. But what do you think are the biggest challenges that Pakistan faces when it comes to turning these international pledges into actual implementation on the ground?
I think Pakistan's single biggest problem is Pakistan's dollar shortage. And I think that really deeply goes into the climate problem. For any adaptation mitigation strategy at scale that you're going to need a lot of dollars. Let's just talk about the energy mix that we talked about earlier, right? The NDCs. If you're going to go from 40% to 60%, and you're going to turn off your furnace oil, turn off your coal, go into solar, wind, hydel, those are all projects that are multi-years, sometimes multi-decade in the case of large dams, and they're billions and billions of dollars that we actually literally do not have. So to my mind, that is problem number one. And then that when you go from the large scale project to like the mid scale project, and you say, okay, I want to kind of work on the water table, because the water table is a big problem, right? So when you try to implement desalination plants, you try to work on the soil testing, you try to improve the fertilizer, then you need R&D, you need like precision drone equipment and all of that, where things that the world is using now to increase agricultural productivity. For example, food security, to my mind, is also a big problem. It's crazy that it's a problem given that we're an agrarian economy, but the fact is, in the last 5 years, we've had at least 3 years with wheat shortage or sugar shortages, which at times have been mafia dependent, but at a lot of times have been weather pattern dependent, or the fact that the farmer is just not making enough money on his land to actually sustain his house, which is why they've actually turned away from the basic crops that you need for sustenance in this country. So I think that the economic model really needs to be looked at, and our productivity is one of the lowest in the world. For a country with literally all the natural resources, we're extremely blessed by Allah. We have all the natural resources. We have great land. We have great soil. We have great weather patterns. For us to be as low on the productivity chart as we are, that is just mind-boggling, to me. So I think we really need to look at how we can train, upskill our farming mechanisms. How do we look at the water table? How do we look at general adaptation strategies, and also making the population at large aware of what's happening. I mean, like smog, for example, the health hazard is billions of dollars. We never quantify it because we cough it out. We're struggling, driving, but we don't quantify the dollar figure of the bill, that the fact that you need to buy air purifiers, they're all imported. The fact that you need N95 masks, they're still imported. The fact that you need to go to, like, multiple hospitals, a lot of the medication comes in. So I think, there's a very dollarized economy in all of this that we're not looking at on the climate mitigation side.
I agree. And of course, something that you said about capacity building, I think it's actually time that we do focus on that, except, relying on other nations and, especially, relying on the global south, because until unless we don't adapt and we don't do local capacity building, like you said, that we need to, reduce our reliance on a heavily, dollarized economy. So there has been a long-standing promise of $100 billion annually from, developed countries. Why has this been so difficult to, fully deliver?
I think, firstly, I would say that the biggest avenue to talk about this is the COP conference annually. And to my mind and my experiences recently of being there, I think it's just become a charade that achieves nothing at all. Everyone's just going there to meet and greet, and it's just a festival, and there's zero objectives that come out of it. So I think that's a very big failure. And I think we're spending a lot of money and sending all of the world's top diplomats, financial advisors, bankers to a place that they're going to come out of with nothing. Secondly, I think the global order really matters, right? The global order is in absolute disarray at this point in time. And if we talk about the one country that kind of leads the charts, has been since the post World War II era, is the United States. And with President Trump in office, you're not going to get anything on climate change. He's literally pulled the rug on most agreements, most financial instruments. And if you look at even the multilaterals, the World Banks, the IFCs, all of that, they're all at some point heavily linked with Washington's,
Yeah,
decision
yeah.
making. So if the multilaterals are gone, if the US is gone, if the COP conference isn't doing anything, who's going to make people pay? And I think we should come to this from a very humane lens. Hypothetically, let's say you're a very rich country and I'm a very poor country. Your house is also on fire. There's bipartisan politics at its peak in the last 60 years. You have high inflation going around now with the Iran war. Oil is really spiraling. There's going to be global inflation or global recession or both. We don't know. Do you have any incentive to give me as a poor country money where your own electorate's fighting for multiple avenues and there's no one pressurizing you in the absence of this global world order that's completely untangled itself? So I don't see how this is going to flow because no one wants to give money and no one's telling anyone to give money.
I agree. And this is, where it comes down to climate justice, because whatever is happening in global north, ultimately the countries who actually pay the price for this is the global south. And you mentioned the war as well. So we are actually ignoring the environmental costs of the
Yeah,
war.
yeah.
And Pakistan is actually one of the countries that will actually face, quite heavy impacts when it comes to that, and when it comes to climate change. So, from your perspective, is climate finance actually reaching the countries that need it the most, or are there structural barriers in the system?
Okay, so I think at times climate finance is really efficient. When I look at organizations that are really developed, like I'm a big fan of the IFC's program, right? If let's look at the Pakistan program, for example, they're saying we have X money. We're calling out all the large business owners, industrialists, agrarians. Come to us with the proposal. If it makes sense, if it's dollarized, if it can give you a return, we're here to help you, right? I think I'm a massive fan of saying if you have merit and if you can scale, we're here for you. So I think some of those institutions are there, but who all can access the IFC? Probably the top 30 entrepreneurs in the country.
Yeah.
That's it, right? So it's not something that can be deployed at scale for the average people. But will it help the Pakistani economy? Will it help climate financing as a global concept? For sure. But then you look at other institutions, this is GCF that with JS Bank did a project that focused on the solarization of tube wells. I mean that scale at its best, where you're literally going to the farmers 2 acres, 3 acres of land, putting a solar installation on their tube well, removing the diesel from their life. So lower cost, lower emission makes a lot of sense. But that project also didn't come to life again. And GCF also did not deploy any other capital in this country. So, even though everyone keeps asking, how do I get registered with the GCF? How do I, get on their loan book or their equity book? I mean, it's a 2, 3 year process at best. And then you qualify with, the global competition. I don't know. And then with their terms of execution, how many people have the capacity in Pakistan to do it? So I do think that, climate finance is, to my mind, a very interesting, nuanced concept that's actually very hard to execute. And I think that it is easier for institutions at the global level to talk to either governments that are efficient in this country. And I actually, surprisingly, the Sindh government's pretty efficient on the climate finance side. They're probably the best government on the climate finance side if you think about it, with their sustainable housing, with the carbon market projects, with their water table projects. Or you're going to have entrepreneurs like the SAF fuel, jet fuel ecosystem. But other than that, I think that I'm most passionate about raising local capital using local entrepreneurs. I meet so many people who are doing great work on e-mobility, on smaller carbon projects, on agri-tech, on precision farming, on water management, on electricity conservation. Those are the things that I think can actually scale, be easily deployed, and these are the things that will bring the confidence in the Pakistani economy that's much needed for these dollars to flow in, for these projects to scale in Pakistan and then scale abroad. And I do think that for climate finance to actually fundamentally become a successful model in this country, we need to have some positive stories to tell, right? If you look at the startup ecosystem from 2022, we had like $500-600 million coming in. We thought, Pakistan was changing. We're going to be the next Indonesia in the next 2 years. And then, boom, everything went out, right? Uh, but good news as well. 2 weeks ago, there was the first full exit when the ride-hailing company bought the Grocer app. So that's a fundamental exit. That's a good story, which will encourage other funds for positive stories. So until in the climate finance fair we have positive stories to tell, I don't think it's going to scale. It's just going to be
Yeah.
nuanced, and you're not going to have successful entrepreneurs jumping in.
100%. And I think, like you mentioned, that this government is actually actively doing a lot, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to, efficient and sustainable policies. We have programs like the Punjab Clean Air Program as well that are actually, I think, can make a difference in Punjab as well. And of course, like, until and unless you don't have positive stories, positive programs, people won't step up and people won't come into this field. So we do need that positive outlook. So now touching a bit about the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement also includes a transparency framework. How exactly do you think our countries monitored and how are they held accountable for their climate commitments?
I think the most transparent and audited mechanism is the NDCs we talked about, the nationally determined
Yeah.
contribution. I don't think that there's a better audit mechanism in place. Um, but that mechanism is only on the government side. It doesn't really look at the private side of things. If you were to fully audit the landscape, then you'd have to go into the multilaterals books, any DFIs, all of that, and kind of plug that together. And I do think one of the other problems that climate finance has, not just in Pakistan but globally, is that we don't have consolidation of data. Everything's all over the place. It's in silos, which becomes a very big problem to actually understand how much is flowing where. So you'd have ballpark figures, but do you have full accuracy? Not to my mind, but I could be wrong. Um, when you touched on the Paris Agreement, talking on that, I would just say, again, it's all about the global order. If President Obama signs something, makes it his headline, literally, the U.S. has the first secretary for climate change in history. And if you look at President Trump's cabinet right now, there's no one who is looking at climate change as a concept. Even he didn't even send his delegation really to COP this year in Brazil, last year in Brazil. So when the global order changes, lots change. And I think President Trump's last presidency really, really kicked, the climate goals aside. And he's doubled down on it now. And he's really focusing on oil and Venezuela and Iran and, ExxonMobil and whatnot. So I do think that, climate change has taken a hit for a number of years now. And I think we'll kind of jump back into action when the world is really, really on fire. And obviously, I think 1.5 C as the global target, I think is already a lost cause. I think we'll wake up when we're closer to 2.5, but the implications will be there at that point.
Yeah, I think that it really does depend on the global order. And with what we're seeing right now, of course, like the priorities are quite different and not right, because they're not focused on a sustainable lifestyle, or they're not focused on peace. So unless that does not change, and unless the priorities don't change, for the top class order, things won't actually make a difference, because all these institutions are heavily linked to, the United States.
Yeah.
So just, wrapping up, I have two questions in mind. What role do you think that organizations like the IPCC and civil society play in ensuring that, the governments stay on track?
From a Pakistan perspective, I mean, I think generally Pakistan civil society is, a really active bunch of people.
Yeah.
And I think, from the rule of law to human rights to, a number of other initiatives. But on the climate side, I feel that, which is why I actually started Climate Finance Pakistan, and that's the name I gave it, was because I didn't want our organization to be a generalist activist organization. And I think that's kind of one of the concerns that I have with a lot of the climate civil society work that's happening here. Although there's great people doing very specific work, and and kudos to them. But I think that, do I see the civil society enacting pressure on the government? I think it comes in waves. When the smog season hits, it's not just the civil society, I think it's the public at large, right? So I think climate change to us is a very visual problem. When the flood hits and we have to run, or when the smog's there and we're coughing, then we're shouting, and then the government reacts. So, do we have a sustained situation where we're, holding them accountable all year long? And to be honest, in Pakistan's current environment, can you actually hold someone accountable all year long at this point in time? That's also a question, right? So, of course, our civil society and other entities are, very active. They're doing some great work, but uh, do I link that to financing? No, I don't really link that to financing. I link that to problems and addressing them, like smog, at a particular point in time of the year.
Yeah, and I think the pool of people who are actually raising their voices constantly is also very little and few. So, of course, until and unless we don't have a large pool of people, raising their concerns all year round, of course, a change won't come by. But I do have to say that, in the coming years, we've seen a lot of youngsters who have been
Yeah.
involved, and we've seen a lot of voices. So I think this is how the change actually comes by. The conversation has started flowing. So fine. Did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to add that I think the fact that we're in a situation where we're not very open as a society generally, I do think that even the younger lot can only say so much, because
Yeah,
through social media, TV, everything's tracked at this point in time. And also, I think with the judiciary also kind of downsizing,
yeah.
that also has a very big role to play, because the environmental tribunals were just getting on a roll. The Supreme Court had just started throwing in some judgments. The high courts had become active across the provinces. I think we've gone back a few years on that front.
We have definitely. So finally, do you think that the current global climate governance system is strong enough to deliver real change? And if you could just, touch upon one or two policies that you think need to improve, especially for countries like Pakistan.
I think generally, if you look at how the framework's been built, for example, where with COP being the conversation tool, with the UNFCCC being the agency that's kind of binding everyone together, with then the multilaterals like the World Bank in place, actively looking at items, with specific funds like GCF in place, with country to country agreements bilateral is in place as well. I think the framework's there. I think the thought to put it all together was really on point. I think the concern is not the framework or the structure of it; it's the execution and the intent of execution of it. So I think that's kind of where we're kind of missing out on. I think the framework's solid if someone's pushing through, but is anyone pushing through is my biggest question.
I think, two, three questions remain that, the push has to come through, and everyone has to, actively play when it comes to climate change, or, when it comes to climate finance. And unless all the actors in the society, they don't play their part, a change won't come by. Thank you so much, Mikhail, for this.
Thank you for having me.
So what we're left is with a system that's ambitious on paper, but still struggling in practice. Global agreements like the Paris Agreement have created a framework for cooperation, but real progress depends on finance being delivered commitments being honored, and countries that actually have the capacity to act. For countries like Pakistan, the stakes couldn't be higher. The challenge now is not about just making pledges, but turning them into tangible action on the ground.
Breathe Pakistan.
A Dawn Media initiative.
Let's weather the change
Together.